celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to today's program. We're going to be discussing life in the People's Republic of China. In order to accomplish that task, we're very happy to welcome to our program a member of the faculty at North Idaho College, Mr. Kurt Nelson. He teaches in the Department of Physics, and some time ago he was invited under a program that's entitled People to People International, which was a program that commenced during the Eisenhower administration. It is set up to be a one-to-one ambassadorship program, and in his case he went with a number of other physics professors, and it was called the International Physics Education Delegation under the People to People program. He was there for 3 weeks, and I know he learned a lot of interesting ideas and concepts during that time. And Kurt, welcome to the program. We're delighted you've taken time to visit with us on that important journey to the East.
It's my pleasure to be here, Tony.
And as always, I'm so pleased to have regular panelist Steve Schink, who is Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Dean Schink to commence the question.
Thank you, Tony. Kurt, could you tell us a little bit more about the International Physics Educators Delegation? Does that group travel to a different spot yearly? And was there something about China that was particularly interesting to you?
Historically, there was a delegation that went to China in the year previous, and the leader of that group lives in Germany, and his commitment is to try to educate third world countries to the physics education processes or thinking that we have internationally to try to help them. And so in so doing, he tries to take a delegation to China, and the international People-to-People International program supported his cause. Upon that invitation, you invited people all over the world to try to go. This delegation this year had 2 Italian teachers, 2 German teachers, 2 Australian, and then the remainder were American. It was a very pleasant group. They were all physics educators in junior colleges or universities. We met at Hong Kong. We never saw each other before that time, and had a dinner and then converged and got to know each other quite fast. That was probably our last knife and fork dinner, but we had to learn to eat with chopsticks thereafter, but it's quite a pleasant experience.
Kurt, was this your first opportunity to join that group, or again, was there something in particular that drew you to a trip to China?
It was the first time. It was upon the invitation. I accepted the invitation, not knowing really what it beheld, but the idea was to give talks to the other professors of physics at other universities and try to input into their style of system of teaching new ideas and discuss with them how we do things, and likewise learn from them. And I think it was a bi-directional thing where we learned a lot from both sides.
Well, earlier you said that the target of these visits were third world countries. In physics education terms, is China a third world country?
China was just not a third world essentially, but an emerging world. And the problem was that we had the Tiananmen Square incident that was called over there. And politically things were squashed for a while, but the borders were pretty well open. The physics community believes in education first, and physics education is their main cause, and politically they don't seem to get too involved, so that we felt quite safe being in China and with that cause. And our intention was not to cause a problem, but to blend in with the educational community, and it was very successful, and it was very low-key. The people that we found, that we visited with, were extremely polite and very kind, gracious, not knowing too much of what the Western world was about or what it had to offer. Geographically, they did not quite understand our university structure, or where Idaho was, or where North America was really located, etc. So it was like visiting a land that had nearly no input at this time. I remember one incident when I bought a sweater for my wife, and I was drawing on the piece of cardboard for the young sales person there, a map of North America. Had Canada and Mexico, and I was explaining these countries, and then pretty soon I had 8 people surrounding that piece of cardboard, wanting and asking questions, wanting information. And then I left the cardboard with them, and that would be external input to their country.
Steve's done such an excellent job bringing us through that process of why you went and all the purposes. I'm sure our viewers would be very interested in knowing whereabouts in China. China is the third largest country in the world geographically. Well, that's changing with the collapse of the Soviet Union, so one would have to place them at another level. But where all did you go? Did you tour a lot of parts of the country or a lot of different universities? Would you just kind of give us a summary
Overview,
of your
sure.
schedule?
Sure, Tony. The intention was to visit 4 cities, and in each city was the universities that we targeted to visit through the leader. One was in Beijing, the city of roughly 5 million, on the northeast side of China, and that's the old Peking. Then we went straight west over a bunch of mountains, flew over in the China Airlines, and landed at Xi'an. And this is a place where the terracotta soldiers were unearthed recently in archaeological digs. That was also a very large city and towards the interior of China. Then we went southwest to a place called Guilin, which is famous for its mountains and its architecture, format for a basis of poetry and artwork and literature, etc. And it's a beautiful place, has bananas and a very lush, nice climate, but a smaller town of maybe 750,000, about the size of Spokane, Washington. From there, we also saw caves and limestone caves and went down a river, and we saw some backcountry, and it's more remote and laid back and quieter. From there, we went to then Guangzhou, which is the old name Canton. So Guangzhou, then we rode a train back to Hong Kong and then departed from Hong Kong. So basically we hit the northeast, northwest, southwest, and southeast of the eastern half of China. The western half of China is quite remote and very few larger cities, let alone universities. We found the universities hemmed in large cities and buildings. Campuses were kind of beautiful, lots of plant life. And what overwhelmed me was the thousands and thousands of people and thousands of students and thousands of bicycles and bricks. Every home is bricks.
And for our viewers who don't know, you really covered the area where the population is because, as you said, western China is
quite remote.
Remote and high mountains, and the population is certainly in the eastern part of the country. I have a couple of questions to get you to compare what went on, and I guess I should preface that by asking you, when you met at those universities and colleges with the professors, I assume that you met in some just private sessions where you compared notes on physics, but did you have the opportunity to lecture before some of the classes of the students themselves?
Yes, we had opportunity to lecture or talk to groups or conferences, and also one-to-one. We had all those opportunities available. However, when you visit China, there is a protocol that you have to submit to, and that is that your delegation leader has to meet with their university president or dean, and they tell about how great an honor it is that you were there, and we say the same. And then you drink tea, and you formally just sit there and wait courteously, and then when your delegation leader announces your name or has you stand up and introduce yourself to the other counterparts at the universities, then from there you can go on walk field trips, essentially walk through the halls, visit the laboratories, talk to students, talk to the professors. But if you don't go through their hierarchical structure, their formality, you're not received. There is a receiving room also at the university, very plush, the best that they have to offer, and if they don't have a room to offer, they rent a local hotel room, and you're received then formally through this echelon hierarchy structure that's necessary to visit with the Chinese. You'll see this occasionally when you watch television of one of our politicians visiting China or Russia, that there's always a formality ceremony preceding your visit.
So in summary, really, you had not only to be received, but you had time with the faculty members, you had time to see the facilities, and you actually were in the classroom where the students were for both, I assume, your lecturing and also hearing their professors lecture.
That's true.
With that in mind, let's talk about some comparisons, and I don't mean that in a way that we're suggesting that one system is has great superiority over the other one. I want to talk about the differences in the setup of the facilities and the kind of presentations. If you don't mind, I have a rather very general question. how about some comparisons and contrast with your experience in this country with colleges and physics and visiting China?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Really, we were taken aback by the idea that they had so many people to educate. And they had high school physics teachers in smaller communities and areas with hardly any money. And that's kind of rings home to me also. How do you make do with what you have? Their structure is that they study physics many years in high school and chemistry and English. And then at the end of their high school, they take an exam for entrance to college. If a
Excuse
student,
me, and if they don't make a
if
certain
they don't
score,
make that score,
they
the
don't go.
10% go to college, and the other 90% go back to the masses and work in whatever the 4 areas that are designated for them. The ones that are selected to go on to college at age 18 then have a chance, are told in some cases what to major in, and then pursue their bachelor's degree, and then they are assigned to a job for the rest of their life. A neat, unique thing was that the university professors that were there worked about 14 hours per week. And they were restricted as part-time employees, we might say, but they're not allowed to hold a second job. And they roughly make about $30 per month, live on the campus, and are barely making it, kind of. A 40-hour work week like what we use, or part-time's 30 hours, is beyond what they're expected to do. Their high school teachers also teach 14 hours per week. I asked a couple high school teachers what they do when they're not teaching. They said they go home and write exams. It's so crowded there that they don't have office space. And Steve, this is difficult to imagine, but if you don't have office space, what do? Then you go home and write exams. Their structure is such that it's exam-oriented. Now, I asked the question, I said, what do you do with people that change their mind and they would like to go back to college, like the community college atmosphere that we are so proud of here at Coeur d'Alene? And it's a non-existent idea. There are no community colleges in China. So this window of opportunity was a depressing idea in my case, where if you didn't make it at age 18, then you are destined to become a worker in the agricultural field, or mechanically fix bicycle tires, or whatever.
Or the factories.
Factories, etc. So I can just imagine what would happen if I tried to tell my children that if you don't get your act together by age 18, you're going to be working the rest of your life, and you know what our people would say. So it's quite a step back. The subject material in physics was really quite advanced. They have quite a bit of equipment in the universities, but it's programmed so that it's all exam-oriented, and I didn't find the freedom of expression that we give our students and the opportunity for expansion of ideas or retraining that's so important to our lives. So I don't see the high tempo flexibility, adaptability in China that we have here. So you're programmed. Window of opportunity, if you don't make it, then you're going to be not going to college. They can take another exam 1 year later and possibly make it, but it's pretty well limited to 10%.
Steve Sheen.
Kurt, did you get any sense of the reason for a 14-hour limit on instructional time for physics instructors?
I think the reason is they want to employ everyone. I didn't see any other reason than that. I didn't pursue it any further. I know it was not allowed. The higher paying people work on buildings, the construction workers, they get a higher salary, and they work full 8-hour days. The store people also work 8-hour days, but the university professors and teachers, being professionals, are limited to that many hours per week. That way they can hire more, I'm sure. Their pay is not terrifically high compared to the worker standards, but their day also isn't as long. Now the 8-hour work day, they take a break from 12 noon until 2 in the afternoon. So they work 4 hours in the morning, the 2-hour break to do probably their local shopping or do errands, etc., and then the 4-hour block after that. So it lengthens the day, so it keeps them busy, I'm sure.
Kurt, you mentioned that if you fail the entrance exams for the university
Yes.
in China, you're assigned to another work area. What about people who pass? Do they have any flexibility, any choice in selecting an area to pursue in their education, or is that assigned on the basis of test results or some other criteria?
I think the largest basis is test results, and then the idea that we need so many of these type people and so many of those, and then they're slotted in. It's kind of like our military system where young people take exams and then there's billets or opportunities for certain skills or schools that they're allowed to go into only upon availability, space available. So I talked to a few of them, and they got closely related fields, but sometimes not totally what they wanted. They seem to be happy, though, once it's in there.
How would you compare the Chinese students that you encountered with the students you teach here at North Idaho College?
There's two things they teach a high school student in China. One is honor thy teacher, and the second thing is work hard, work industriously. And so when I visited a high school, there's no discipline problems whatsoever. There's 48 people in the classroom, very close quarters. They smile and they nod, and they're polite, and they'll visit with you, and they like to practice their English. And so the idea that is crowded is all right, but the student itself is very well motivated. And I think the motivation comes from that window of opportunity idea, and not from the fact that they're doing it because of, they're looking optimistically, but they're doing it because they want to better their lives, every one of those students that I talk to. They want to improve their life situation, and they're very optimistic. I didn't find a pessimistic person in China anywhere, and they're all very optimistic on the storefronts everywhere. And that's a good feeling to see that.
Well, you traveled so much and you met so many people in shops and in classrooms and in other settings. It sounds like communication with people was not a major problem for you.
No, it seemed like the younger the person, the better their English. That's a pretty good rule of thumb, but an older person, 50, 60, 70 years old, does not know English, but the middle-aged and the young people know it. So if you stand and visit with someone, there's always an interpreter handy, or an intermediary. So English is very easily understood in China. And they study English many years in their high school. You have to recall that maybe 6 years of English. It's kind of like English that's learned, but it isn't practiced because they don't have the opportunity to practice with English-speaking people. So they really treasured a few moments when some of our delegates talked to an English class in the high school. They listened to every word intently, their diction and the slang, and you had to explain a little bit unusual words at times, but they just really treasured that opportunity to hear an English word spoken.
You made a comment that was really interesting. For some years I've taught a course on the politics of the USSR and China. Of course, with the collapse of the USSR, that certainly means overhauling a course, but in the Soviet Union, it was very, very different from China in the pay structure. In the Soviet Union, university professors were one of the better paid. They made oftentimes 4 or 5 times more in salary than, for example, bus drivers, or even much more, 5 times more than medical doctors.
Sure, it's the opposite in
the
China.
Opposite of China. So
yes.
In other parts of the world, even from country to country, it really varies. When you were visiting those universities and looking at the student body and so forth, how about exchange programs? Were there many young people that were from other countries, or were in the classes most all of them citizens of China?
Most students were citizens of China. There's a few foreign students from European and Asian countries. The problem with China that I witnessed was that the education is paid for by the government, so that a student cannot accumulate any money to travel overseas or apply for scholarships and try to get to another country, such as England or the United States. If they do, they have to be a graduate student and nearly have a full ride in our country. An undergraduate student at a community college or a 4-year school would be nearly unheard of because they don't have the money to travel or go overseas. And so you're only going to see graduate students from the mainland of China. And of course, Taiwan is different, the Chinese structure there is different, and also Hong Kong. But from the mainland, I don't think you'd ever hardly see an undergraduate student here.
Now, in relation to their advancement, once that 10% are in, what is the time period for what we call the undergraduate degree, or like the baccalaureate degree? How long does it take?
It's a British system, Tony, and it's a 4-year system.
Okay.
Graduate school is usually overseas, and quite a few of the senior physics students or teachers were educated in the United States or England.
So there's not a lot of graduate programs, and not a lot of graduate programs in China itself. That you say that they mostly send their students other places for the advanced degrees?
Some students for advanced degrees, but most of them are still there in China. The ones that get away from their country then go back to the national laboratories and work. I met quite a few, and they had talked about the university they went to and the professors that they had. And they're very pleasant, and they had studied overseas, but they were then working in the laboratory on research. mostly research and development jobs.
In this country, we have a very different system, as you said, about admissions. Of course, some of our major universities, most prestigious universities, obviously have rather strict admission requirements, but a lot of the state universities admit huge numbers of students, and then the community colleges have the concept of the open door policy. And since you've indicated that it's very different, only 10%, once they're in, my suspicion would be, and am I correct, that during that 4-year period that there's not much dropout or failure, that most of them make it once they've already been through that process to get in?
I didn't witness any dropout rates. It seems like most of them seem to make it. If they dropped out, they transferred to an alternate field. But eventually they all pretty well graduated. The stress level is quite high, and I didn't ask questions such as suicide rate and some things that I thought were politically uncomfortable for me. But I know that that's a force that's there, that the pressure is quite high to finish and achieve what they were assigned to achieve.
Another specific question in that area is, you indicated that you observed that the professors have the 14 hours and they do a lot of writing exams, so I hear you say that as far as judging the progress of students, it's very based on, heavily upon exams. Do they exam very often, and do they have other requirements other than examinations?
They have the national exam for high schools for college entrance. I did find that out. And they also have standardized books written by Chinese professors which were modeled from the Western physics textbooks. To walk into a classroom and see a Western book was unheard of. I didn't see any Western physics books or any books that were from the external part of China. If they were there, they had to be sent as a gift to the professors. But the textbooks they use are written by their own system. The exams are national exams, and so you teach towards a national test.
But do they have other requirements other than the examinations? Like in this country, we have a lot of research of book reports, term papers, and those kind of things that you observe?
No, it's like maybe going back, Tony, to when you and I were in grade school and we did what was told and never asked any questions of our teachers, and it was pretty well you did it and didn't ask questions idea.
Before back to Steve, one other final question of the professors, since you talked about their lecturing and their preparing exams. Within the university, are they encouraged to do publications themselves, or is that left more to those who work in the national labs and so forth?
Well, there's two treasured things in China if you're at a university level professor. One is to publish, and the more articles you publish and the more names that you can come up with on your publisher list, the more honorable or the more impressive you will be. Another thing that they like is titles, and so you'll have assistants and heads and deans, not deans but chairs of this and that. And so they're really up on titles or hierarchy build-up. Even though it may not pay anymore, they like the title concept and also the publishing concept. What they really treasure is a letter coming to a professor in China that would be from a foreign country. It would have a foreign stamp on it and shows that they have some international reputation. Quite often the stamps are removed by the time the letters get there in China.
Steve Sheen.
Kurt, you and I talk about equipment all the time, so I'm somewhat aware of the expense of the things that you need to do a good job of teaching in your classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Did you recognize a lot of the equipment that you saw in the Chinese classrooms? Are they well equipped by our standards?
We recognize all of the equipment. The physics delegation, of course, is used to equipment of all kinds, no matter what the age, and some physics equipment can be 100 years old and still be efficient and effective.
Sure.
Their equipment is quite old. Some of it's hand-built. They do have Apple computers in their high schools and universities, but there's no disk drive system, so it would be pretty much like 1978 on our campus when we purchased our first personal computers. They're Apples, and they have IBMs. The large universities have larger mainframes, and they're teaching programming languages in BASIC and Fortran. So they're not too far behind us technologically, but I don't see the proliferation of software that we have now, and the usability and the adaptability and flexibility that our system promotes.
We could talk about physics and technical matters for a long time. I'm sure you could, and I would understand none of it. So I can't help but ask a question or two about the trip in general. You mentioned some of the scenery that you saw, and you traveled all over the country, with the exception of some of the remote regions. What struck you most as a tourist? Not as a physics instructor, but as a tourist in China.
As a tourist in China, if you think about it after you get done with the trip, some things come come rising to the top. And one of the impressive things was that all the buildings are made of brick. And all of China is a clay-based material, and it's a very handy material to make houses and buildings out of. And so people store bricks in their yard, and I think the commodity of exchange there would be bricks, if I had to say what it was. Another thing that amazed me was that every piece of flat ground had food growing on it, whether it was corn or whether it was rice or other exotic vegetables. But anything that was flat had some produce on it. They also had people everywhere working at something, so I didn't see a lot of unemployment or people loitering. Another marvelous thing, I didn't witness any people getting in fisticuffs or fights or have law enforcement problems. Such a massive number of people. The women would walk around on the street at night alone, which is not really a nice thing to do in our country. And you just felt different because of these things that you noticed that were extremely unusual for us to witness.
Was there evidence, and I can remember quite a bit being made of this a few years ago, less said now since the political unrest there, but did you notice signs of privatization in the economy and generally?
Well, certainly. A lot of the little shops were about 12 feet across the front, and they had the family shop. It's kind of a family enterprise, and they call it free market. Of course, the guide said it doesn't mean everything is free, and he'd laugh. A good pun. But there's some entrepreneurship there. You'll see evidence of it in the small factor because the people are busy with their ideas, and they're not squashed too much from it that we could see. There were some enterprising storefronts and some ideas that the store shelves are full. That amazed me. Clothing was all over the place. Food was all over the place. There were lots of stuff. People were buying and shopping continuously. The qualities of the food was not really there for everyone, but everyone was eating. China is full of food. And everywhere you see water buffalo, as there are no tractors, not too many tractors, but lots of water buffalo and people raising food by the tons. I don't think China would have a problem feeding themselves at all.
So some of the scarcity problems that we hear and read so much about in the Soviet Union were not in evidence in China at all.
Well, that's true. The shelves are full.
One final question. We have about a minute and a half.
Yes.
There's a lot of talk about that China may collapse now after the Soviet Union, or it's one of the last strongholds left of communism. I know that wasn't your purpose, the political, but did you get any sense that there might be a major change in their political system?
Yeah, if I said the word political, the books that I have read about Chiang Kai-shek and about Sun Yat-sen and some of their leaders, they think that all of their leaders were great, and Chairman Mao is a great person, and Chiang Kai-shek was great. And I never pursued it any further to embarrass the Chinese or tell them I had a different view of it ever. But they think that all their leaders were great, and they serve their leaders well.
I have to, with that, interrupt. Thank you very much, Kurt Nelson. On behalf of Steve Shink and our staff, thank you. You've been very informative. It's been a very interesting program, and thank you for taking time to do it.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed our program, and I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we will discuss another issue that we believe is of great significance. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.